In the dark, desperate months of early 1942, the Pacific Ocean was rapidly becoming a graveyard for American aviation. From the smoking ruins of Pearl Harbor to the dense jungles of the Philippines, the skies belonged entirely to one terrifying machine, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. American pilots, flying heavier, slower aircraft, were learning a brutal and bloody lesson. If you tried to outturn a Zero in a dogfight, you didn't just lose the engagement, you lost your life. The Japanese Empire had unleashed an aeronautical masterpiece, and their elite pilots, veterans of years of combat in China, openly mocked the clumsy, barrel-shaped fighters of the United States Navy. They believed the Americans were soft, undisciplined, and technologically inferior. For a terrifying 6-month period, it seemed they were absolutely right. But what the Japanese High Command didn't know was that their unchecked arrogance was fueling an obsession back in the United States. Deep inside the sprawling factories of the Grumman Iron Works in New York, American engineers were quietly abandoning old dogmas. They weren't just trying to build a plane to match the Zero. They were forging a massive, heavily armored, 2,000-horsepower monster designed with a single ruthless purpose: to completely erase the Zero from the sky. To truly understand the sheer shock and terror the Japanese Mitsubishi A6M Zero inflicted upon the Allies, one must look at the state of the world before December 7, 1941. Western intelligence agencies had fatally underestimated Japanese aeronautical engineering. Racism, hubris, and isolated thinking had led American and British commanders to a dangerous conclusion. They believed that Japan was only capable of producing cheap, inferior copies of outdated Western aircraft. They assumed Japanese aviation was years behind the curve, and that their pilots were poorly trained and incapable of handling high-stress modern dogfights. This catastrophic miscalculation was paid for in the blood of hundreds of Allied airmen. When the war in the Pacific ignited, the Zero emerged not as a cheap copy, but as a revolutionary leap forward in naval fighter design. It was a phantom that could strike without warning, seemingly appearing out of nowhere over Allied fleets and remote island bases. This was because the Zero possessed an unprecedented, almost unbelievable combat range of over 1,900 miles. No Western intelligence officer believed a carrier-based fighter could fly that far from its fleet, engage in heavy combat, and successfully navigate back. The Zero's legendary creator, aeronautical genius Jiro Horikoshi, had achieved this impossible range and agility through a fanatical, almost obsessive dedication to weight reduction. The Imperial Japanese Navy had demanded a fighter with impossible, contradictory specifications. They wanted extreme range to cover the vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean. They wanted devastating firepower, capable of bringing down heavy bombers. And they demanded the slow-speed maneuverability of a World War I biplane to win any turning dogfight. To achieve this impossible trinity, Horikoshi was forced to make ruthless engineering compromises. Every single ounce of non-essential metal was drilled out, shaved down, or completely removed from the airframe. Even the pilot's seat was drilled with holes to save a few precious grams. The plane was built from a top-secret, incredibly lightweight, and highly classified aluminum alloy known as extra super duralumin. This material was significantly stronger than standard aviation aluminum, but far lighter, allowing the Zero's structural frame to be terrifyingly thin. But this supreme agility and unmatched range came at a hidden, fatal cost that would only be revealed later in the war. To save that critical weight, the Zero had virtually no defensive armor plating to protect the pilot from incoming machine gun fire. Furthermore, it completely lacked the self-sealing fuel tanks that were rapidly becoming standard safety features in modern Western fighters. A self-sealing tank uses layers of rubber that expand when pierced by a bullet, preventing fuel leaks and fires. The Zero had none of this. It was essentially a flying samurai sword, incredibly lethal, lightning fast, and boasting terrifyingly tight turning circles, but fundamentally fragile. A few well-placed incendiary machine gun rounds from an American plane could ignite the fuel vapors, turning the beautiful Zero into a raging, uncontrollable fireball in a matter of seconds. However, in the bloody opening chapters of the Pacific War, this extreme fragility simply didn't matter. It didn't matter because Allied planes simply couldn't catch them, couldn't outclimb them, and couldn't get behind them to land a solid shot. The primary fighter for the United States Navy and Marine Corps at the outbreak of the war was the Grumman F6F Wildcat. The Wildcat was affectionately known by its pilots as a rugged, heavily built little barrel of a plane. It was built tough, embodying the core American engineering philosophy of pilot survivability above all else. It featured heavy steel armor plating behind the pilot's seat to stop bullets from the rear. It had thick, bullet-resistant glass in the canopy and heavy, self-sealing fuel tanks that could take a severe beating without erupting into flames. The Wildcat could absorb a tremendous amount of structural punishment and still manage to bring its wounded pilot home to the carrier deck. But in a one-on-one dogfight against the Japanese Zero, the heavy, underpowered Wildcat was desperately outmatched. It was sluggish in a climb, requiring much more time to reach critical combat altitudes. Its top speed was completely underwhelming compared to the sleek, aerodynamic Japanese fighters. When American pilots encountered Zeros over the bloody skies of Wake Island, the Coral Sea, and the steaming, malaria-infested jungles of Guadalcanal, they found themselves trapped in a deadly dance they simply could not win. If an American pilot, relying on outdated training manuals from the 1930s, tried to engage in a traditional turning dogfight, the results were almost always fatal. The Zero, with its massive lifting wings and feather-light frame, would effortlessly loop tightly around the Wildcat's wide turning radius. In a matter of seconds, the veteran Japanese pilot would slot perfectly onto the American's tail. Then, they would unleash a devastating, armor-piercing barrage from the Zero's twin, wing-mounted 20mm cannons, tearing the Wildcat to shreds. The casualty rates for Allied fighter squadrons were horrifying and deeply demoralizing to the fleet. A powerful psychological phenomenon, soon dubbed Zero Fever, began to infect the American and British ranks across the entire Pacific theater. Terrified pilots whispered in dimly lit briefing rooms that the Japanese planes were supernatural. They claimed the Zero could stop dead in mid-air, reverse direction on a dime, and climb vertically like a rocket without stalling. Young, inexperienced American aviators were being sent directly into a brutal aerial meat grinder. They walked to their cockpits, knowing that the moment their wheels left the wooden flight deck, the mathematical odds of survival were stacked heavily against them. Desperation, however, forced brilliant tactical innovation among the surviving veterans. American squadron commanders, most notably the legendary tactician Lieutenant Commander John "Jimmy" Thatch, realized a harsh, undeniable truth. Fighting the Zero on its own terms in a horizontal turning fight was absolute suicide. Thatch sat down with matchsticks on a wardroom table and developed a revolutionary, mutually defensive formation. This tactic, which would become famous as the Thatch Weave, required immense flight discipline and absolute nerves of steel. Two Wildcats would fly in a wide, parallel formation, constantly weaving back and forth across each other's flight paths in a continuous, intersecting figure-8 pattern. If a Japanese Zero aggressively got onto the tail of one Wildcat, the American pilot would not try to outturn the superior plane. Instead, he would turn sharply and directly toward his wingman. This dangerous maneuver would drag the pursuing Zero directly into the crosshairs of the second approaching Wildcat. It provided a brief, head-on window of opportunity to shoot the unarmored enemy fighter down before it could react. It was a brilliant tactical band-aid, relying entirely on flawless teamwork, intense discipline, and the Wildcat's rugged ability to take a few hits while acting as live bait. The Americans had to unlearn everything they thought they knew about classic aerial combat. They learned the hard way to never ever dogfight a Zero. They learned to dive from high altitudes, use the heavy weight of their planes to build up massive kinetic speed, take a single firing pass at the enemy, and run away as fast as their engines could push them. This hit-and-run tactic, known as boom and zoom, kept many of them alive to fight another day. But surviving a war of attrition is not the same thing as winning one. The United States Navy High Command in Washington knew that tactical tricks, defensive weaves, and hit-and-run tactics would never win the brutal war in the vast Pacific. To push the deeply entrenched Japanese empire back, they needed absolute, unquestionable air superiority. They needed a completely new kind of fighter plane. They needed an aircraft that could not only take a punishing hit like the Wildcat, but could decisively outclimb, outgun, and outrun the very best aircraft the Japanese Empire had to offer. The urgent, desperate message sent from the bleeding front lines of the Pacific back to the engineering desks in America was crystal clear. Do not build us a nimble acrobat. Build us an apex predator. Build an aircraft around the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, the largest, most powerful radial engine in existence. Strap 6 heavy .50 caliber Browning machine guns into its thick wings. Wrap the pilot in heavy steel armor, fill the wings with massive self-sealing fuel tanks, and don't worry about how heavy the final product gets. We need a beast that can hunt and kill the ghost. And back in the United States, behind the closed doors of the Grumman Iron Works, the engineers were doing exactly that, preparing to unleash a monster that would change the course of the war forever. By the grim summer of 1942, the United States Navy was bleeding from 1,000 cuts across the Pacific theater. The relentless, terrifying advance of the Japanese Empire seemed utterly unstoppable, At the absolute spearhead of this rapid conquest was the aeronautical enigma that haunted every Allied pilot, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. American military intelligence officers sitting in Washington and Pearl Harbor were completely baffled. Desperate reports from exhausted, terrified surviving pilots described an enemy fighter that seemingly defied the known physical laws of aviation. It could climb at an impossible rocket-like angle, turn on a literal dime, and possessed a range that allowed it to strike from aircraft carriers positioned hundreds of miles away. Wild, demoralizing rumors spread like wildfire among the battered American ranks. Some whispered in dark canteens that the Japanese had somehow acquired stolen, highly classified blueprints of a revolutionary new Western engine. Others firmly believed the Zero was constructed from a mysterious, newly discovered lightweight alien alloy, completely unavailable to the Western world. To defeat this deadly phantom of the skies, America knew it needed more than just a brand new plane on the drawing board. They needed to capture a fully intact, flyable Zero, tear it apart, rivet by rivet, and brutally expose its mechanical soul to the harsh light of science. But Japanese fighter pilots were under strictly enforced fanatical orders to completely destroy their aircraft if they were forced down over enemy territory. The Zero was meant to remain a terrifying secret, a phantom that struck without warning and left absolutely no trace behind. However, in the bloody mathematics of global war, the fate of entire nations often hinges on the absolute smallest of margins. A sudden gust of Arctic wind, a momentary miscalculation, or a single stray, insignificant bullet can change the course of history. On June 4th, 1942, during a major diversionary Japanese attack on the remote Aleutian Islands in Alaska, that moment of historical chance finally arrived. A 19-year-old flight petty officer named Tadayoshi Koga launched his A6M2 Model 21-0 from the rolling deck of the aircraft carrier Ryujo. His combat mission was to fiercely strafe deeply entrenched American positions at Dutch Harbor. The Aleutian Island chain was a desolate, frozen, and completely unforgiving theater of war. It was a place characterized by blinding, impenetrable fogs, freezing, sideways rain, and violent gale-force winds that could tear a plane from the sky. As Petty Officer Koga descended aggressively through the thick, freezing overcast to unleash his heavy machine guns on a moored American flying boat anchored in the bay, chaos erupted. Heavy, desperate ground fire from the fiercely defending U.S. troops filled the gray Alaskan sky with deadly shrapnel. Amidst the deafening roar and the chaotic anti-aircraft barrage, a single, solitary .50 caliber bullet found its mark on Koga's agile fighter. It didn't strike the heavy engine block, and it miraculously didn't hit the young pilot in the cockpit. Instead, it cleanly severed a small, seemingly insignificant oil return line running under the fuselage. Koga immediately noticed the slick, black, terrifying trail of engine oil rapidly smearing across his clear glass canopy. He watched in horror as his critical oil pressure gauge began to drop rapidly toward zero. He knew with absolute certainty that his highly tuned engine would violently seize within mere minutes. He could never make it back over the freezing ocean to the safety of the Japanese carrier. Following standard, rigorous Japanese military protocol, Koga used hand signals to inform his two accompanying wingmen that he was going down. The designated emergency landing zone for the strike force was a flat, grassy valley located on the remote, uninhabited Akutan Island. From high in the air, the valley floor looked smooth, solid, and welcoming. It appeared to be a perfectly manicured green runway, neatly nestled between the jagged, snow-capped volcanic peaks. Koga carefully lowered his landing gear, executed a technically flawless approach, and braced his body for a rough but entirely survivable touchdown. But the harsh Aleutian terrain was incredibly deceptive and notoriously deadly. What looked like solid, reliable ground from 1,000 feet up was, in harsh reality, a deep, waterlogged muskeg. It was a treacherous, bottomless, spongy bog cleverly hidden beneath a thin, deceiving layer of green vegetation. The exact moment the Zero's extended landing wheels touched the earth, they didn't roll across the grass. They instantly sank deep into the thick, gripping, freezing mud. The sudden, violent, and absolute deceleration caused the lightweight aircraft to immediately flip violently forward onto its back. The plane cartwheeled, slamming the fragile glass cockpit directly downward into the freezing, muddy water. The massive impact snapped Tadayoshi Koga's neck, killing the young pilot instantly upon impact. High above the crash site, his two loyal wingmen circled the smoking wreckage in the gray sky. Their standing, unquestionable military orders dictated that they must heavily strafe and utterly destroy the downed fighter. They had to ensure it could never fall into the hands of American intelligence. But looking down at the overturned, half-submerged Zero, they couldn't be absolutely certain if their friend was dead or simply trapped alive inside the cockpit. Unwilling to ruthlessly fire their heavy cannons upon their comrade in arms, they made a fateful decision. They chose to turn back to their carrier, firmly believing the brutal, unforgiving Alaskan elements, and the deep mud would completely consume the wreckage anyway. It was a deeply human choice, but it was a fatal, catastrophic mistake for the Japanese Empire. For over a month, the priceless Japanese fighter lay completely undisturbed in the desolate valley. It was a silent aluminum tomb slowly sinking deeper into the freezing Alaskan marsh. It wasn't until July 10th, 1942, that the tides of the intelligence war finally shifted. An American PBY Catalina patrol plane, blown far off its usual navigation course by a severe Arctic storm, was flying low over the island. A sharp-eyed gunner suddenly spotted the faint, unnatural glimmer of silver aluminum violently contrasting against the bleak green landscape. A heavily armed Navy recovery team was immediately dispatched into the treacherous Alaskan wilderness. When the freezing American sailors and combat engineers finally reached the remote crash site, they literally couldn't believe their eyes. Despite being flipped completely upside down, the so-called Akutan Zero was incredibly, unbelievably pristine. The soft, deep mud that had tragically killed its pilot had also acted as a massive protective cushion. It had perfectly preserved the fragile airframe, the powerful engine, and all the invaluable, highly classified flight instruments. The physical recovery operation was a monumental, back-breaking logistical nightmare. Exhausted men sank up to their waists in the freezing, sucking muck for days on end. They used heavy hemp ropes, improvised wooden sleds, and sheer, agonizing brute force to carefully extract the aircraft. They had to pull it piece by heavy piece through the wilderness without causing any further structural damage. Shrouded in the absolute utmost secrecy, the dismantled Zero was carefully crated up in wooden boxes and shipped far away from the front lines. It was transported under heavy guard to the Naval Air Station North Island, located in sunny San Diego, California. The captured aircraft was placed under 24-hour heavily armed Marine Guard. Inside a deeply restricted, brightly lit hangar, elite American aeronautical engineers descended upon the ultimate prize of the Pacific War. As they meticulously and obsessively reversed-engineered the fighter, restoring it perfectly to flight condition, a profound shift occurred. The terrifying supernatural mystique of the Zero finally began to evaporate. It was rapidly replaced by cold, hard, exploitable engineering facts. They discovered exactly, down to the rivet, how the Japanese had achieved such miraculous performance. It was extreme, ruthless, and highly dangerous weight reduction. The Zero was systematically stripped of absolutely everything that didn't directly contribute to its agility or lethality. It had no heavy armor plating anywhere to protect the pilot's back or head. It lacked the heavy, self-sealing rubber fuel tanks that were vital standard equipment on all American combat planes. This made the Zero essentially a highly explosive flying powder keg waiting for a single spark. The frame itself was constructed from a unique, top-secret aluminum alloy called Extra Super Duralumin. It was incredibly light, remarkably strong, but highly brittle and flammable under direct fire. By late September 1942, the repaired Akutan Zero was proudly repainted with massive American star insignias. It was fully fueled, armed, and finally ready to fly under a new flag. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders, a highly seasoned and fearless Navy test pilot, took the controls. For weeks, Sanders engaged in intense, highly classified mock dogfights high over the California desert. He flew the captured Zero against the absolute top American fighters and the best pilots the Navy had to offer. He aggressively pushed the captured Ghost to its absolute, breaking mechanical limits. And high in the blue sky over California, Sanders finally found the bleeding Achilles heel of the invincible Ghost. He made a series of critical, war-winning discoveries. First, he discovered that at high speeds, anything over 200 knots, the Zero's control surfaces became incredibly stiff. The ailerons locked up, making it almost completely impossible to roll the plane quickly when diving. An American pilot in a heavy Wildcat could easily outdive and outroll a Zero at high velocity. Furthermore, the Japanese engine utilized an outdated float-type carburetor system. If an American pilot executed a sudden, violent dive or a negative G maneuver, the Zero couldn't follow without catastrophic consequences. Under negative G forces, the Zero's engine would be starved of fuel and temporarily stall out, coughing thick black smoke and instantly losing critical speed and altitude. The intelligence gathered from these grueling test flights on the Akutan Zero was an absolute tactical goldmine. It was immediately and urgently disseminated to every single American fighter squadron fighting across the vast Pacific theater. Desperate pilots were finally given a proven scientific doctrine to survive and win. Never, ever try to outturn a Zero at slow speeds. Instead, use your superior armor and massive weight to dive away at extremely high speeds. Then, pull up sharply and attack from above in a deadly hit-and-run tactic known as boom and zoom. If a Zero gets on your tail, dive aggressively and push the nose down. Its engine will violently sputter, and its controls will helplessly lock up as you speed away. The psychological myth of Japanese invincibility was permanently, irrevocably shattered by a single plane in a muddy ditch. But more importantly, these precious, hard-won engineering insights were rushed securely across the country. They were sent directly to the smoke-filled drafting rooms of the Grumman Iron Works in New York. The dedicated engineers working on the U.S. Navy's massive next-generation fighter, the F6F Hellcat, now possessed the ultimate weapon. They had the exact, perfectly detailed blueprint of their enemy's soul. They knew exactly where the Zero was weak, exactly how it burned, and exactly what the Hellcat needed to do to destroy it. The long, terrifying reign of the Zero was finally over. The brutal hunt was about to begin. Back on the eastern seaboard of the United States, thousands of miles away from the freezing mud of Alaska and the bloody jungles of the Pacific. The sprawling manufacturing plants of the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation in Bethpage, New York, were humming with a relentless, frantic energy. The brilliant engineers at Grumman, led by the legendary founders Leroy Grumman and Leon Swearbull, had received the terrifying combat reports. They had studied the desperate telemetry from the Pacific, and they had thoroughly analyzed the top-secret data extracted from the captured Akutan Zero. The message from the United States Navy was unambiguous and strictly uncompromising. They did not want a fragile, acrobatic dancer to try and match the Japanese Zero in a slow-speed turning fight. They wanted a massive, heavily armored, unstoppable flying tank that could absorb horrifying amounts of punishment and still completely obliterate anything in its path. Grumman was already famous in aviation circles for building incredibly tough, rugged aircraft, earning their factories the affectionate nickname, the Grumman Iron Works. But to hunt and kill the mythical Japanese Zero, the ironworks had to build something entirely unprecedented in the history of naval warfare. The design philosophy for the new F6F Hellcat was brutally simple, uniquely American, and highly effective. Instead of meticulously shaving off ounces of weight to gain a slight maneuverability advantage like the Japanese engineers did, the Americans decided to simply overpower the weight problem with pure, unadulterated, earth-shattering mechanical brute force. At the very heart of this new beast was the most powerful aviation engine available to the Allied forces, the legendary Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp radial engine. This monstrous, twin-row, 18-cylinder mechanical titan was an absolute marvel of modern industrial engineering. It displaced a staggering 2,800 cubic inches and generated an earth-shaking 2,000 horsepower. To put that into stark perspective, the Pratt & Whitney engine produced nearly twice the raw horsepower of the engine inside the Japanese Zero. When this massive engine roared to life on the test stands, it literally shook the ground beneath the engineers' feet, deafening anyone standing too close. To translate all of that terrifying mechanical power into actual thrust, the Hellcat required a massive, specialized propeller. Grumman fitted the aircraft with a colossal, three-bladed Hamilton Standard propeller measuring over 13 feet in diameter. Because the propeller was so incredibly large, the Hellcat had to be designed with unusually long, widely spaced landing gear. This gave the aircraft a distinctive, aggressive, nose-high stance when resting on the wooden flight decks of American aircraft carriers. It looked exactly like a massive, coiled predator preparing to violently launch itself into the sky. But raw speed and climbing power were only half of the deadly equation needed to win the Pacific War. The Hellcat had to be able to completely destroy an enemy aircraft in a single, fleeting fraction of a second during a high-speed diving attack. To achieve this, the engineers packed the Hellcat's thick, muscular wings with a devastating array of heavy weaponry. They installed 6.50 caliber Browning M2 heavy machine guns, precisely harmonized to converge their fire at a specific distance ahead of the plane. These were not the light, rapid-fire rifle-caliber guns used early in the war. These were heavy, armor-piercing, incendiary weapons capable of chewing through aluminum, steel, and human flesh with absolute terrifying ease. The Hellcat carried a massive payload of 400 rounds of ammunition for each of the inner guns and 200 rounds for the outer guns. When an American pilot pressed the firing button on his control stick, the 6 heavy machine guns erupted simultaneously. They unleashed a solid, concentrated wall of heavy lead and explosive incendiary fire that would instantly vaporize any unarmored Japanese aircraft caught in its path. But the most crucial design element of the F6F Hellcat, the feature that truly separated American engineering from Japanese philosophy, was pilot survivability. The United States Navy valued the lives and the expensive training of its aviators above all else. The Grumman engineers armored the Hellcat like a flying medieval knight. They bolted 212 pounds of heavy, bullet-stopping steel armor, plating directly behind the pilot's seat and headrest. They installed a massive, thick slab of bullet-resistant glass in the front windshield, capable of stopping a direct hit from a heavy machine gun. And most importantly, they fitted the massive belly and wings with cutting-edge, self-sealing rubber fuel tanks. If a Japanese bullet managed to pierce the Hellcat's fuel supply, the thick rubber would instantly react to the leaking fuel, swelling up and sealing the hole in seconds. This prevented the catastrophic fires and explosive fireballs that routinely destroyed the fragile Japanese Zeros. The Hellcat was designed to take a savage, merciless beating from enemy cannons and still bring its pilot safely home over hundreds of miles of open ocean. However, all of this heavy steel armor, massive weaponry, and the giant 2,000 horsepower engine created a significant logistical problem for the Navy. The Hellcat was a massive, heavy, and extremely wide aircraft. Space on the crowded wooden flight decks of American aircraft carriers was incredibly limited and highly valuable. To solve this, Leroy Grumman himself helped perfect a brilliant, highly complex mechanical system known as the stow wing. Using a heavy, reliable hydraulic system, the Hellcat's massive wings could be folded back neatly alongside the fuselage. They tucked in tight against the body of the plane, drastically reducing the aircraft's footprint. This ingenious engineering marvel meant that the U.S. Navy could pack significantly more of these lethal fighters onto every single aircraft carrier in the fleet. By late 1942, the final blueprints were approved, the prototypes had successfully flown, and the United States government unleashed the full, terrifying might of American industrial manufacturing. The Grumman factory floors became a chaotic, deafening symphony of heavy industry operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Tens of thousands of American workers, including a massive influx of dedicated women affectionately known as Rosie the Riveters, manned the loud, sparking assembly lines. They worked with a patriotic, fiery obsession, knowing that every single rivet they pounded brought their boys one step closer to coming home. The production numbers achieved by the Grumman Iron Works were absolutely staggering, defying all previous records in aviation history. At the peak of its incredible production run, the Bethpage factory was rolling a brand new, fully armed F6F Hellcat off the assembly line every single hour of every single day. They were building the massive iron beasts faster than the Japanese Empire could ever hope to train new pilots to fight them. By the middle of 1943, the first massive squadrons of these brand new, shining silver and dark blue monsters were finally ready. They were loaded onto the sprawling decks of the new, fast Essex-class aircraft carriers, pointing their massive noses toward the bleeding Pacific. The American pilots, many of them surviving veterans who had suffered brutal defeats in the underpowered Wildcats, climbed into the spacious armored cockpits of the Hellcat for the first time. When they pushed the heavy throttle forward and felt the terrifying, earth-shaking power of the 2,000-horsepower radial engine roar to life, a profound psychological shift occurred. The deep-seated terror, the demoralizing anxiety, and the crippling zero fever that had plagued the American fleet simply vanished. Sitting behind thick bulletproof glass, surrounded by heavy steel armor and commanding 6.50 caliber machine guns, the American pilots finally knew the truth. They were no longer the desperate, outgunned prey fighting for survival in the bloody skies. The Iron Monster had been unleashed, and they were finally the apex predators, heading back to the Pacific to hunt the Ghost. By the late sweltering summer of August 1943, the very first operational squadrons of Grumman F6F Hellcats finally arrived in the Pacific Theater. They were painted in a striking, brand-new three-tone camouflage of dark sea blue, intermediate blue, and white. These massive, heavily armed iron beasts were securely strapped to the wooden flight decks of the new Essex-class aircraft carriers. The veteran American fighter pilots, men who had miraculously survived the darkest, bloodiest days of the early war, were incredibly eager for revenge. They had spent months training with the new aircraft off the coast of California, learning to harness the terrifying 2,000-horsepower Pratt & Whitney engine. Now, they were heading directly into the fiercely defended heart of the Japanese Empire, actively looking for a fight. The very first major combat test for the new American Predator came on August 31st, 1943, over the heavily fortified Marcus Island. As the massive formations of blue Hellcats roared out of the morning sun and descended upon the Japanese installations, the enemy was caught completely off guard. When the veteran Japanese fighter pilots scrambled to their Mitsubishi Zeros and frantically took to the sky, they made a fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. From a distance, the Hellcat shared a very similar barrel-shaped silhouette with its older, much slower predecessor, the F4F Wildcat. The arrogant Japanese aces, completely unaware of the engineering revolution that had taken place in New York, smiled in their cockpits. They assumed they were about to slaughter another slow, underpowered American squadron, just like they had done countless times before over Guadalcanal and the Coral Sea. They confidently pushed their throttles forward, engaging their lightweight Zeros in the familiar, tight-turning maneuvers that had always guaranteed them an easy kill. But the absolute shock, the pure, unadulterated terror that struck the Japanese pilots in the ensuing seconds, is difficult to put into words. When the Japanese pilots attempted to effortlessly loop over the incoming Americans, the Hellcats didn't try to turn with them. Instead, the American pilots remembered the top-secret intelligence gathered from the frozen mud of Alaska. They forcefully pushed their heavy control sticks forward, plunging the massive, heavily armored Hellcats into terrifying, high-speed vertical dives. The giant Pratt and Whitney engines roared, easily pushing the heavy planes well past 400 miles per hour. The Japanese pilots, flying their fragile, unarmored Zeros, desperately tried to follow the Americans into the dive. But exactly as Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders had discovered during his classified test flights, the Zero's controls locked up completely under the extreme wind resistance. Their outdated float-type carburetors violently choked and sputtered under the negative G-forces, starving their engines of fuel. The Japanese could only watch helplessly in absolute horror as the American planes rapidly accelerated out of range. But the Hellcats didn't just run away. They used their massive kinetic energy to pull up sharply, rocketing back into the sky. They positioned themselves high above the struggling Zeros, perfectly executing the deadly boom and zoom tactic. And then, the heavy American Predators unleashed hell. When the veteran U.S. pilots squeezed their triggers, the 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns tore the sky apart. They poured a concentrated, devastating wall of heavy armor-piercing and incendiary lead directly into the fragile, unprotected wings of the Zeros. Because the Japanese planes still lacked basic self-sealing fuel tanks and pilot armor, the results were instantaneous and deeply horrific. The legendary mythical Zeros, the undisputed ghosts of the Pacific, violently exploded into massive, uncontrollable fireballs. They shattered into thousands of burning pieces of aluminum before their pilots even had a chance to react or bail out. In those first few violent, chaotic encounters, the psychological myth of the invincible Japanese Zero was permanently erased. The hunters had officially become the hunted. Over the next 10 months, the U.S. Navy ruthlessly pushed across the vast expanse of the Pacific, island by bloody island. The Grumman Hellcat was at the absolute forefront of this massive, unstoppable American offensive. It systematically destroyed the Japanese Imperial Navy's air power, racking up an unbelievable, entirely unprecedented kill ratio. For every single Hellcat lost in aerial combat, American pilots were violently shooting down 19 Japanese aircraft. The Japanese military high command was in a state of absolute profound panic. They had lost nearly all of their elite, highly experienced veteran pilots in the grinding war of attrition. To replace them, Japan was forced to throw terrified, severely undertrained teenage conscripts directly into the cockpits of their outdated Zeros. These young boys, with barely 50 hours of total flight time, were being sent up against battle-hardened American veterans flying the most advanced, heavily armored killing machine on Earth. This massive disparity in technology, training, and raw mechanical power violently culminated on June 19, 1944. It was the epic, sprawling Battle of the Philippine Sea, remembered by history as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The desperate Japanese Imperial Navy launched a massive, coordinated armada of over 400 aircraft to attack the American Fifth Fleet. It was a final, all-or-nothing gamble to stop the relentless American advance toward the Japanese home islands. But the United States Navy was waiting, and they were perfectly prepared. Using advanced, highly classified shipborne radar systems, American combat information centers detected the massive Japanese strike force while they were still over 100 miles away. The alarms blared across the massive decks of 15 American aircraft carriers. Within minutes, hundreds of heavy Grumman F6F Hellcats were scrambled into the humid Pacific sky, violently climbing to intercept the incoming enemy. The American pilots, stacked up in massive formations at 24,000 feet, patiently waiting in the bright sun for the Japanese to arrive. When the massive, uncoordinated Japanese formations finally broke through the clouds, the American Hellcats aggressively dove upon them like a swarm of angry, heavy iron wasps. What followed was not a traditional military battle. It was an absolute, one-sided, mechanized slaughter. The inexperienced Japanese pilots, flying without heavy armor and without self-sealing tanks, panicked immediately under the terrifying American assault. They desperately tried to initiate slow-speed turning dogfights, completely abandoning their formations and flying directly into the crosshairs of the heavy American machine guns. The sky over the Marianas quickly filled with hundreds of dark, twisting trails of thick black smoke and massive, brilliant orange explosions. Flaming Japanese aircraft rained down from the heavens, violently crashing into the dark blue ocean below in a terrifying, continuous shower of burning metal. Inside the armored cockpits of the Hellcats, the American pilots were in a state of absolute awe at the sheer destruction they were inflicting. One American pilot famously keyed his radio microphone amidst the chaotic burning sky and yelled back to his carrier, "Hell, this is just like an old-time turkey shoot down home." By the end of that single, unimaginably violent day of combat, the statistics were almost impossible to comprehend. The United States Navy had utterly annihilated the Japanese attacking force, shooting down over 350 enemy aircraft in just a few hours. In stark, horrifying contrast, the Americans lost only 29 planes in the aerial combat, with many of those pilots being safely rescued from the ocean. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot broke the absolute back of the Japanese Imperial Navy's air arm once and for all. The Mitsubishi Zero, once the most feared and respected phantom in the entire world, had been reduced to a fragile, burning coffin. The Grumman Iron Works had delivered exactly what they promised. The Iron Monster had completely dominated the Pacific sky, paving the bloody, irreversible path toward ultimate victory. The absolute, unmitigated disaster of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot effectively destroyed the Imperial Japanese Navy as an offensive aerial threat. Japan had completely lost its most experienced, battle-hardened pilots, and with them, the terrifying mystique of the Mitsubishi Zero was buried forever beneath the waves of the Philippine Sea. The desperate, bleeding Japanese Empire was now fighting a brutal, losing war of attrition against an American industrial machine that simply could not be stopped. The massive factories back in the United States, led by the relentless Grumman Iron Works, were pumping out new aircraft, new ships, and fresh, well-trained pilots at a completely staggering rate. Faced with absolute, unavoidable defeat and the terrifying prospect of an American invasion of their home islands, the Japanese military high command made a dark, horrific pivot. They abandoned all traditional military strategy and fully embraced a deeply fatalistic psychological warfare tactic that would shock the modern world. They introduced the terrifying concept of the kamikaze, translated as the divine wind. Since their inexperienced, poorly trained teenage pilots could no longer win a traditional dogfight against the heavily armored American Hellcats, they were given a new, horrifying directive. They were ordered to turn their obsolete, fragile Zeros into massive flying bombs. The young Japanese pilots were instructed to load their aircraft with high explosives, fly through the heavy American anti-aircraft fire, and deliberately crash their planes directly into the wooden flight decks of U.S. warships. It was a tactic born of absolute, terrifying desperation, and it changed the entire grim nature of the naval war in the Pacific. The American fleet was suddenly facing a terrifying new threat where the enemy pilot had absolutely no intention of surviving the engagement. To counter this apocalyptic suicidal wave, the United States Navy relied completely and entirely upon the rugged, heavily armed Grumman F6F Hellcat. The massive American fighter was instantly transformed from a highly aggressive apex predator hunting in the clouds into the absolute, unbreakable shield of the entire Pacific Fleet. American commanders established massive, complex rings of early warning radar picket ships miles ahead of the main aircraft carrier task forces. Above these vulnerable, isolated radar ships, massive squadrons of blue Hellcats flew endless, exhausting combat air patrols, entirely dedicating themselves to intercepting the incoming suicide planes. When the massive swarms of kamikaze Zeros descended from the dark clouds off the bloody coasts of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the Hellcats were waiting for them. The heavy, 2,000-horsepower Pratt & Whitney engines allowed the American pilots to quickly climb and intercept the incoming threats before they could get anywhere near the vulnerable aircraft carriers. But intercepting a kamikaze was a deeply terrifying, entirely different kind of aerial combat. You couldn't just damage the enemy plane or scare the pilot into retreating. A damaged kamikaze would still try to crash into a ship. The American pilots had to use the sheer, catastrophic brute force of their 6.50 caliber heavy machine guns to literally saw the Japanese planes into pieces in mid-air. They had to completely vaporize the unarmored Zeros, detonating their explosive payloads safely in the sky before they could reach the fleet below. The heavy, armor-piercing incendiary rounds of the Hellcat proved to be the absolute perfect weapon for this grim, mechanical butchery. The fragile, highly flammable Zeros, devoid of any heavy armor or self-sealing fuel tanks, were violently shredded by the devastating American crossfire. The skies over Okinawa were constantly choked with thick black smoke and the massive, brilliant fireballs of detonating Japanese aircraft. The Hellcats absorbed terrifying amounts of return fire, shrapnel, and debris from the exploding planes, but their heavy steel armor consistently protected the American pilots inside. By the time the Empire of Japan finally, unconditionally surrendered on the deck of the USS Missouri in September 1945, the final official combat statistics were almost impossible to fully comprehend. The Grumman F6F Hellcat, the massive iron beast built specifically to hunt the mythical ghost of the Pacific, had achieved the most successful combat record in the entire history of naval aviation. During its relatively short, violent operational lifespan, American pilots flying the Hellcat were officially credited with violently destroying an astonishing 5,156 enemy aircraft in direct air-to-air combat. To put that staggering number into perspective, the Hellcat was solely responsible for over 75% of all aerial victories recorded by the United States Navy during the entire Second World War. And it achieved this incredible bloody feat while maintaining an unbelievable, historically unprecedented overall kill-to-loss ratio of 19-1. For every single Grumman Hellcat that was tragically shot down by a Japanese fighter, 19 enemy planes were violently erased from the sky. The aircraft produced a staggering 305 official American fighter aces, men who had achieved 5 or more confirmed aerial victories. It was the ultimate, undeniable validation of the core American engineering philosophy of pilot survivability, heavy firepower, and overwhelming industrial brute force. The terrifying Mitsubishi Zero, the once invincible samurai sword of the sky, ended the brutal war as a tragic, broken symbol of a defeated and burning empire. It had been completely outclassed, outgunned, and out-engineered by a nation that refused to accept defeat in the dark days of 1942. The highly classified intelligence gathered from the muddy, freezing grave of the Akutan Zero had paid off in ways that completely altered the trajectory of human history. After the end of the Second World War, the rapid, unstoppable dawn of the new jet age quickly rendered the massive propeller-driven Hellcat obsolete. The screaming jets of the Cold War replaced the deep, thunderous roar of the massive radial engines on the decks of the world's aircraft carriers. But the legendary F6F Hellcat had already accomplished exactly what it was desperately built to do. It had held the bloody line when the world was burning, it had protected the terrified young sailors of the fleet from absolute destruction, and it had ultimately won the war in the Pacific. It stands today as a timeless, heavy iron monument to the sheer, terrifying might of American industry. But more importantly, it stands as a testament to the incredible bravery of the young, exhausted American men who climbed into those armored cockpits and flew directly into the dark, unknown jaws of history. Thank you so much for watching this deep dive into one of the most incredible engineering rivalries of the Second World War. If you enjoyed this untold story of aviation history, American firepower, and the legendary Grumman Iron Works, please hit that like button right now. It really helps the channel grow and allows us to keep digging up these incredible forgotten tales of heroism from the past. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our upcoming feature-length historical documentaries. We have so many more incredible stories of war, technology, and human endurance coming your way very soon. And before you go, drop a comment down below and tell us what you want to see next. Which legendary tank, forgotten battle, or iconic fighter plane should we cover in our next video? Let us know in the comments, and we will see you on the next battlefield.